Hello, everybody. This is Roy Edwards with Capital Presence. I'm here to talk to you today about introduction to permissions within SharePoint. So, getting started, office.com will be your landing page for all things O365. This will be your starting point for the SharePoint application, among other applications. So, we'll go ahead and go to office.com. That'll pull up a landing page after you have signed in with your company credentials. That'll look a little something like this. If we click on SharePoint under the apps area, that'll bring up SharePoint. If we click on what I like to call the waffle in the top left, that's where you'll see SharePoint on the drop down. So we can go ahead and click that. Okay, so before we get into too much of the permissions from here, let's talk about the benefits. So the benefits is to make sure that users only have access to the information that they're privy to, and they still have the information and necessary access to do their jobs. You also want to make sure that you are an administrator. If you're not an administrator or have some sort of rights to control permissions, you won't be able to go forward with this, what we're not about to talk about, because not everyone has access or the ability to amend or grant permissions. So first, from within the application, whether it is a list, library, or site, sharing is caring. And so in the top right, you will see that share button. It has an arrow pointing out and says share. I have highlighted it there in red. You can grant access directly to a site, list, or library simply by clicking this share tab. This will give you the option to share with resources and invite them to the site, list, or library. So once you click that magic little button, you'll get a pop-up something like this that says share. Our site is called Sandbox, and so it says, would you like to share the sandbox? Invite people, or we can choose shared with. That will show us all the members who we are currently sharing the site with. So from here, you'll be able to put any uh, email address of somebody within your environment. If an administrator has granted you access to be able to share outside of your organization, you could also add somebody else's email here that is outside of your organization. But by default, you're only allowed to share from within your organization. So you would type in your email address. You could include a note or a message of some sorts there. And if you were to just click share from there, it would send an email to say this person has granted you contribute rights to this. If you were to click show options, this is where you could turn off any email or grant further permissions. The gear is probably the more um, uh, traditional way of granting permissions. It's the more technical way of granting permissions. Generally, when somebody is granting permissions, it's done by an administrator and not through someone just sharing a site. This is the more kind of longer way of doing it, but it's definitely the more secure. So as always, the gear is your friend. So if you click on the gear, in this instance, we're using a list, so it'd say list settings. That would bring you to the list settings page, which is fun-ish. So there is a lot of information here, but for mostly we are going for this, we're going to focus in on permissions to this list. It would also say permissions for this site if you are on a site, or library if you're on a library. But for this instance, we are on a list, so we want to click permissions on this list. So this is where you are able to change or set permissions. It is important to keep a couple tips in mind. You want to create groups and then add people to those groups instead of adding people directly. This makes it a lot more easy to manage and upkeep as time goes on and more people are being added. It's also important to know the difference between inherited and unique permissions. Inherited takes the default permissions set by the site, and unique breaks that inheritance and then enables you to grant permissions that are unique to that site. So people could have access to a list that doesn't have access to the site or different areas. Something to keep in mind. So roles are also important here. Members, they can contribute, or they also have contribute access, was another word for it. They can edit and add documents, they can make changes, but they can't change the overall structure. Visitors have a read-only access. They'll be able to see the information but not make changes. Owners will be able to change the site settings, grant permissions, share, and make changes and edits. It should be keep relatively small, and then full control should be kept even smaller. This should be for developers and administrators only. They'll be able to do pretty much anything. So when you're going out on your own, this is breaking inheritance. In the top left, when you get into that set permissions for the site's list or library. In the top left, you'll see stop inheriting permissions. This will mean that you are currently inheriting permissions and you wish to break that. So if you click stop inheriting permissions, it'll give you a pop-up warning saying, hey, slow down. This site says, and then it'll say, are you sure you want to do this? You're going to break the permissions. Uh, Go ahead and click OK. It's all right. You're not going to break anything. You can always revert back to the inherited permissions with a simple click of a button. So you're not going to break anything. So go ahead and click OK. What this will do is you'll be able to now edit these permissions and amend them however you wish. Anyone you wish to grant access to by simply adding a group or adding new members, you'll be able to do so. So now you'll be able to work wherever. You'll be able to grant people access, give them access to documents, lists, information, sites, and again, SharePoint is really the backbone of the O365, and these permissions can be set and used throughout all applications. So if you wanted to grant people access to something within SharePoint and then share it within your Microsoft Teams application, you can. This is how you'll be able to track documents. You'll be able to see who's collaborating on them. Really, permissions is kind of the gatekeeper for everything you do. So before we get any further into this, I will go ahead and I will show you a demo of this. So if we go into, I'm not sure why I can't dismiss that. There we go. So if I go ahead and click share, this would be through the application. I can invite somebody, so I'll go ahead and invite myself. See if I pop up. There I am. You could include a message. This is a test. And if you go to show options, it does by default always send out an email invitation. Now, most of you are thinking, of course, you would always want to send an email invitation out, right? Because you want people to know they have access. That's true, but if you're an administrator, oftentimes they'll say, hey, I tried to get access to this and I wasn't able to. Can you grant me the permissions? They already know and know that they're going to be getting an email address or are going to get access. They probably don't necessarily need an email. Or if you're doing a bulk ad and you're just creating something from scratch, you might not necessarily want every single person to get an email. It's up to you if you keep it on or off. By default, people will have members or contribute access. So by clicking the drop down, you'll be able to choose whatever it is that you want. I'm going to leave it at contribute. You go ahead and click share. Or if you wanted to go up here and you say, who is this already shared with, you'll be able to see everyone who this is currently shared with. So we'll go ahead and invite people. We'll go ahead and do this. Leave me a contribute, hit share, and it's as simple as that. Now, an email would come to me and I would be able to, since it's me, which I just heard it go off, so that person would now have access. Alternatively, you can go into the gear, you can go to list settings, and you would go to permissions for this list. And so now this would all have your permissions. You would then hit stop inheriting permissions and you'd be able to grant. Or if you wanted to check for permissions, you could simply say, Roy Edwards, I want to make sure he has permissions. You click check now, and then it gives you all of the ways that I would have permissions to this. So that's pretty much the overview. That's how permissions works, that's how it's run, and that's how to administer it. If you were to hit stop inheriting, it would break all permissions, and then you could also just go back and hit manage and re-inherit the permissions. You could also click manage the parent if you are an administrator. That would then bring you to the top level permissions. Here I can grant permissions, I can create a group. So if I wanted to call this group testing group, you can set the group owner here. You can say who can view the permissions, who can edit the permissions. You can put at what level, design, edit, contribute, read, approve, all of these. Really, you want to stick to the main ones, which are full control, contribute, read, and members. So that's really the ones you assign. If I hit create, I'll put it as edit, hit create, and then now you'll be able to add people to this group in bulk the same way as we saw the share. You'll see that same window here. So you can add people in bulk, send out an email invitation. But if you notice when we have the options area, it does not have an area for you to change what level permissions they have. That's because when we just created this group, we had already set that. So that is able to change. You can change and add group permissions, but this is how you would grant access. So now that you have all of that set, you are in control of your permissions. Now you can control who sees what and what people can edit and interact with. It is important to note that permissions can be deleted at any time. So if you grant it to somebody and you're like, oh man, I really shouldn't have done that, you can easily just remove them. You can rename the permissions, groups, you can change their roles. There's a million things you can do with permissions. It does get rather complicated, which we will have more training on this, but this is a general overview and introduction to permissions. Permissions can be granted on multiple levels. Like we just went over and saw, you can inherit and you can set up unique permissions, and you can do it both. So you can have a site where you are inheriting site permissions, and then on the list level, break that inheritance and create its own level of permissions for that specific site. So it is possible to use inherited and unique permissions at the same time. As always, if you guys have any questions, go ahead and go to support@capitalpresence.com. Find us on social media @capitalpresence, or you can go to capitalpresence.com, find my friendly face, and you'll find all my contact information there. Hope you guys got a lot of information out of this, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.